What's significant for all of us, of course, is how do we educate our children and how do we become educated? The word education comes from the Latin words educare, to draw out. Well, what are we drawing out? There's something within each of us that has to be drawn out, and something of great value. We saw, for example, that if we are beings, human beings who are created in the image of God, again, that central concept is so important, then we have a potential for great love, great creativity. We have strengths within that need to be actualized. So human beings throughout life, we need to not only keep in shape physically, we need to keep in shape intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, because that's who we are as human beings. So it's always necessary to keep in mind that framework for value. We all realize as we get older that we need physical well-being, and we've got to maintain some sort of physical shape in terms of exercise and so forth, diet. Emotionally, we need to also work on our emotions so that we have self-management, self-control of our emotions, and also how we respond to others. It's necessary to be aware of empathy or the control or direction of our emotions. Our emotions may be based on wrong thoughts or right thoughts, and we'll see in a moment what that means. So it's a question always, to what degree are we actualizing that power within, that potency within that can lead to actual value? So we saw in the earlier lecture that we are created in the image of God. How do we draw out the divine nature within, and how do we draw out the divine nature with others? The relationship that we experience is something that we are born for. We are bound together in relationship. Solidarity and fraternity are the means by which we develop a human community. Right now we have communities, tribes, nations, states, all kinds of difficulty. What we haven't become is a human community. We haven't felt those bonds of fraternity. In the abstract, we all want peace on earth, goodwill to human beings, especially this time of year. But what does that mean? It means we have to work at that. We have to learn about other languages, other cultures, so that we can find the common ground, the common good. By seeking the common good in our local community, even as I mentioned last night, a neighbor holding a reception for a new neighbor. It was such a beautiful thing. I felt a lot of people hadn't seen before. I saw them maybe, but I've never talked to them. They live in houses just 2 doors down, and yet somehow the opportunity wasn't there until last night. The neighbor made the effort and created a nice buffet so we can get to know each other. It's a beautiful concept of neighborliness, of being a good citizen. Well, to be a good citizen of the world, we need to do the similar kinds of things. We need to somehow expand our consciousness so that we experience the reality of others. Again, nations have suffered just like individuals have suffered. I never realized till I was speaking with someone a few weeks ago how the Hindus were suffering under the Muslims, and other people were suffering under you name any people who have not suffered under others. You know, there's always been the hatred of the other. Anyone unlike ourselves, when the first settlers came here, the Indians were barbarians, and they could be enslaved, and African Americans were slaves. Well, they came from Africa, they must be slaves and meant to be slaves. Where are all these concepts coming from? They're coming from a failure to recognize the solidarity of the human community, the fraternity, the caring for others in the human community. So the love energy needs to be guided by norms, virtues, principles. Again, the first principles. Just like we have within us the potential for great dignity and value, cultures have that same kind of potential. So we can build healthy cultures. We can build what's called a culture of empathy or compassion if we keep that in mind. It's like our musician this morning has a great idea of playing music as a wonderful band in Oracle before thousands of people. Well, unless he has that vision, it doesn't happen. The book I was reading about, an individual, almost with his skill and his luck, has developed a business that employs thousands of people and impacting the entire world. Well, if that can happen with technology, are we using that technology to build genuine friendship around the world? Are we really creating, it's like technology is in the saddle riding humanity rather than humanity being in the saddle riding technology. So many articles this week in the New York Times, books that have come out indicating that young people lack now the concentration to stay with an idea and develop it carefully because they're so used to multitasking. There is no sense of multitasking. You have to focus on what you're doing and then develop your ideas. It's so clear to me in teaching English and history, it's difficult for children to develop their ideas now for some reason. Their the sentences are too short. What's happening? They don't really focus on the ideas. As I said, just even reading A Christmas Carol was very difficult for students, even though it was in plain English. There are some difficulties in reading it, but not to the degree to which these kids were experiencing those difficulties. Difficult to focus. There's a book that just came out by Daniel Goleman called Focus, the fellow who developed the books on emotional intelligence and so forth. So our young people are being betrayed by technology rather than using that technology to enhance themselves. Interestingly enough, most of the big moguls in Silicon Valley send their kids to a school that doesn't have any kind of computer technology. Isn't that interesting? But what does that tell you? It tells you that they have to first develop these other characteristics. I mean, if technology will teach us to love more deeply, to understand each other more carefully, obviously it does have great benefits. But our children are misusing it, and often parents are just confused. How do I control what my children are doing on the media? Much bullying happens now through the media. And as you've read many times, the horror of what happens to children who feel bullied because their face or the insults or whatever appears on the media in their name, or something is misused that they shared with someone. So the dignity that is within, the value that is within each of us has got to be drawn out. And that's why there are teachers, mentors, older people. Each of us, whoever, old or younger, it doesn't really matter as long as we can help whoever the person that we're with. And that's why, again, I like the virtue of prudence. Prudence means making good choices. So in any situation, we can talk about all these abstract ideals, but what does it mean in terms of the specific person in a particular moment that has to do with a real situation? It's like the difficulty with religion, teaching, or any helping profession, or any relationship. How do you know what to say, what to do with a specific human being? If you're in a classroom, each child is very different. You have to know, how do you relate to this child? Can you say things to encourage this child? Say it strongly. Another child, you can't say anything strong. This child's very, is already being self-critical. You have to be very careful. So one size does not fit all. In religion or in teaching or in anything, there has to be the reality of how can I use whatever wisdom I have. That's why praying for wisdom is so important. How do I actually apply these principles to specific situations? How do I educare, draw out what is the best within each sensitive human being? And I have to be very careful. Each of us in a helping profession has a tendency for arrogance and abusing, misleading, exploiting young people. That's why there's such a burden. You have to always be careful in any position where you're with someone who's younger, someone you're trying to teach, that the potential as a therapist, as a teacher, as a religious leader, not to exploit or misuse that relationship. Because it's such where someone becomes dependent upon you to some degree. And there has to be tremendous care not to hurt those who you want to help. It's just like loving another person. You always hurt the one you love, the one you shouldn't hurt at all. The ink spots knew that years ago. So the potential value becomes actual through relationships. We're born for relationship and value. Love energy needs to be guided by norms, virtues, principles. So we have that potential for great dignity and great value, but it needs to be drawn out. Now, there are alternative views of education. Perhaps every age comes back with the same two views of human nature. If you've read Hard Times by Dickens, he has a character there named a teacher by the name of Gradgrind. And Mr. Gradgrind wants to fill the little pictures in his class that everybody is seen as a blank slate or an empty picture. And his job is just to fill those pictures. So the image of human beings as blank slates or empty pictures, and you just fill them up. It's somewhat like now teaching for the test. In other words, kids need to know a certain amount. We've got to focus on that, nothing else, and we got to make sure that these tests go up. Score yesterday, big day. We went up 3 percentage points in certain scales of 8th grade reading or math. It seems to me like, well, that's the one. There is that element. We do have to teach kids to spell, even to handwriting. Did you notice that kids have no handwriting anymore? It's gone. But that's not a good thing. Sometimes you might want to write a love note to someone. They don't want it on a type or on the computer. You know, there's nothing like a handwritten note, thank you, or I love you. You know, don't want to give your wife or your friend, a little note on a piece of tape, or an email or whatever, a Facebook thing, I love you. Okay, great, 400 people read it. There's room for handwriting is an extension of yourself. Actually, all technology is an extension of yourself. If you've read Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s, the medium is the message. So radio, TV, iPods, whatever, they're extensions of ourselves. But there are intimate extensions of ourselves, such as handwriting, and there's the more general extension of ourselves in various kinds of technology. So one type of worldview, one, again, set of basic principles is the one in which we assume human beings are blank slates, especially children. We fill them with facts. And Mr. Gradgrind, from his name, you can tell what he does to the children. Now, there's another view called progressive education. Progressive education makes the assumption that human beings are like plants. And you just have to water those plants. And like this and this and this, so the plants will flower, children will become beautiful and wonderful. So we spent 50 years miseducating our kids. That's why California went from number 1 to number 50 in terms of the quality of education for our children. Children don't have to know anything until they're ready to know it, said A.S. Neill, the founder of Summerhill, and the book by that name. Well, that's a problem because many of our kids learned to focus on themselves. And only when they were ready to be respectful or caring, then they were. If they weren't, they could call their teachers by their first name. They could ignore them. They can ignore older people. They don't have to open the door for someone because they weren't ready to do it. Well, they're already 30 years old now, whatever. Now, obviously, progressive education, the image of the child as a flower naturally unfolding, there's some truth to that. Some benefit came. Certainly, teachers became much more sensitive to children, and that is a good thing because the Gradgrinds of the world were grinding it out. And the children who were in classes of progressive education the teachers were very, very sensitive to them, at least on some level, and that was important. In fact, the irony of a school like Summerhill was that actually Mr. and Mrs. Neill, A.S. Neill, actually worked very hard, very dedicated, completely devoted to the children. And some of the kids got that message. It's like mom and dad, I had wonderful parents, but they didn't necessarily tell me things about the world is evil in this way or be careful here. Their example was good, but I had to learn about some very difficult things out there by myself. The same thing with A.S. Neill. The kids saw how dedicated the parents of A.S. Neill and his wife were, so they learned to be dedicated and turned out to be good kids. But it's a dangerous road to go along because so many kids will just find themselves, all of a sudden they're not around their home. It's like Telegraph Avenue is the same way it was 40 years ago. I see these kids who look like they come from foreign countries where there's traditions and certain values. Telegraph Avenue, let it all hang out. I mean, literally. Why? I'm free now, and the whole idea of freedom, of course, becomes licensed very easily. No guiding principles. Even though they're 18 years old or whatever, everything they learn at home, probably they'll go through some very significant and difficult relationships, and then they'll come back to, when mom, in fact, I had dinner with someone the other day who's gone through some really funny, not exactly bohemian, but semi-bohemian behavior. And then he said to me, his parents, have passed on, And he said, you know, what I'd like to get back to is what my mom and dad were telling me when I was 15 years old. The kid's 45 now. And he's gone through all these messy relationships. And his parents were actually very good parents, had real clear principles, and they were somewhat strict, and he's just realizing now at age 45 that this path of dalliance was not very instructive or constructive in his life. And it broke up all kinds of relationships and children that, divorce and all kinds of stuff. Whereas his parents were trying to set an example of someone who'd really build something healthy. And only now, it was funny, but tragic funny when he told me, can you help me get back to where I was with my parents when they could guide me? And then, we talked, and he was happy. And I noticed in my email, he wants to meet again on December 3rd. He's setting up, okay, he's got the point. So progressive education has its problems in terms of developing human behavior. The question always is, what kind of human beings do we want? Do we want free-floating, sensitive human beings who just go their own way? Or do we want people who are of good character, seeking to do something excellent with their lives and helping to draw out excellence of others? Another basic set of principles, another worldview, another sense of human nature, is that offered by liberation theology. Again, seems like a very positive thing. There's exploitation in the world. Corporations do rip off developing countries for various reasons. Look what happened in the Middle East when the colonial powers basically controlled the Middle East. They took all the oil and they gave very little to those Middle Eastern countries. But liberation theology, even though it emphasizes the rights of the poor, a special option for the poor, the development of a Catholic social thought, nevertheless, what it turns out is that it's one group against another group. The priests who are the revolutionaries versus the non-revolutionaries who have to be conquered, killed, whatever. It doesn't offer the positive movement forward in terms of, well, what kind of society are we going to try to build? What is our nature? What is our purpose? So the goal of human excellence, the goal of education, is ideally to develop people of good character who could build good families, do good work, and contribute to the community. Live well, love well, and work well. That's what we all need to do in life. Even Freud said that. Live well is to know how to use that which we have. This is the being that has to be developed. This is what we have to use. This is how we got to make value. So to live well is to use this thing in a good way. Even in schools, to ask the question, what is human excellence? I'm not sure people are asking that. They're asking how many percentage points did you get in the latest standardized test? A different question. You're going to get different results. So it's necessary to have a sense of human excellence. Building a good family. How do you do that? What is it about? What does a good family look like? How do you build a healthy community? At least we have to ask those questions. It's not a good family, just the core family, but a good family over generations. Every family impacts generations. It's sort of like, it's interesting. You meet somebody in life, they take you down one road, very difficult to get back if that's the wrong road, especially if it impacts children and other people down the road. It's necessary to think about lineage. It's great. You think about lineage, what is that? What's all that nonsense? Lineage means that you have generations to consider. If you're going to marry somebody, what's the foundation of that marriage, and how do you think that marriage will play out over generations? Will you be committed to your grandchildren?